What if I told you that Apple White from Ever After High was originally going to become the next evil queen? And when I say that, I am not talking about the swapped at birth theory. I am talking about the evil Apple arc, which is the theory that the writers of Ever After High had originally planned for Apple White to go through an arc where she briefly becomes the evil queen at the end of the series. Anyway, hi guys, my name is Ainsley from Fairy Tale Vibes, and welcome back to another Ever After High video. Now, if you do want to know more about the Ever After High swapped at birth theory, which is the theory that Apple and Raven were swapped at birth, you can check out my previous video, which is all about that. But today we are specifically going to be looking at the evil Apple arc theory as requested. I know I mentioned the evil Apple arc briefly at the end of my last video about the swapped at birth theory, and I said if you want me to make another video just about the evil Apple arc, I will. And so many of you said, we want to know about the evil Apple arc. So today we are finally covering the evil Apple arc in totality. We are going to be answering why the heck Apple would even turn evil, why I think the writers were foreshadowing her becoming the next evil queen, and what it all means. So to help all of you better understand the evil Apple arc, we are going to be covering three main things in this video. The first thing we will cover is basically the foreshadowing and basically the clues and the hints throughout the series that I think were the writers hinting at us and telling us that Apple would eventually try to become the evil queen. So that's the first thing. The second thing we are going to be covering is Apple's character arc thus far. So we are basically going to look at Ever After High from beginning to end and see where Apple's character is, how she has changed throughout the series, how much her character has grown, because then the third and final thing we are going to be covering in this video is basically predicting what the evil Apple arc would have been, what would have gone down. And the reason we are going to cover her character arc thus far is because basically in my prediction, the evil Apple arc would have happened, you know, basically after Dragon Games, after Epic Winter, after where the series ended, because unfortunately it was canceled, so we never will truly know if the evil Apple arc was going to happen. But if it would have happened, it would have happened at some point after Dragon Games, after Epic Winter. So that is going to be the final thing in this video. I will basically predict what I think the evil Apple arc would have been and how it would have played into her past character development, because Apple is a very complex character. First of all, let's look at the foreshadowing, which I believe was the writers trying to tell us that Apple White would eventually try to become the next evil queen. So a lot of the foreshadowing relates to Apple White just having more similar traits to the typical evil queen archetype, whereas Raven has more similar traits to the typical Snow White archetype. Now, what do I mean by the Snow White and evil queen archetypes? The reason I am saying that is because actually, I would just say evil queen and Snow White, but Snow White, Apple's mom, doesn't even act like the typical Snow White archetype either. What I mean when I say the archetype is I mean the sort of character traits that were assigned to the evil queen and Snow White in the original fairy tale. Because you have to remember, Ever After High exists in a destiny cycle where the characters and their sons and their daughters are following the same destinies over and over again. So Apple's mom is not the original Snow White, Raven's mom is not the original evil queen. And actually neither Apple nor her mom Snow White really act how the original Snow White would. So let's talk about how Apple and Raven act and why Apple seems to be more similar to the evil queen. So Apple herself is very vain. She is very obsessed with her appearance, just like the evil queen was in the original fairy tale. Now we literally see this in an episode where Apple is obsessed with talking to her magic mirror, and when this magic mirror breaks, she basically has to order a new one right away because she can't live without this magic mirror basically complimenting her outfits every day. And it's just like, Raven is the one with the evil queen destiny supposedly, yet Raven doesn't even talk to a magic mirror when the magic mirror is literally a very important part of the evil queen destiny. So it's just very weird that Apple's the one talking to it, and I think that was very obvious foreshadowing for the evil Apple arc. But on top of that, like, it just shows that Apple is vain. The second thing is Apple is selfish, just like the evil queen. And you guys may say, oh no, Apple's not selfish. She does care about others. Apple does, I think, somewhat care about others, which I'll get into that in the next section. But like, Apple's not inherently evil, but she is selfish. So for example, whenever someone compliments her, instead of saying thank you, she just goes, I know. And additionally, Apple White doesn't really think that much about other people's problems, until it kind of like affects her. Like, she didn't really think that much about like the issue with the destinies, because quite honestly it just didn't really affect her because she always had a happily ever after, and she claims to understand Raven, but I don't really think she truly ever tried to understand where Raven or other people with bad destinies are coming from, you know. Additionally, Apple White is also just very obsessed with popularity and becoming, you know, the next queen, the next Snow White, which I think is very funny because in the original Snow White archetype, in the original Destiny, Snow White didn't care about being queen, like I said. Snow White also never cared about being the fairest of them all. That was always the evil queen. The evil queen was always the one who was so obsessed with being the fairest of them all, with basically outdoing Snow White, being better than Snow White. Literally, the evil queen wanted to be Snow White. Do you hear what I'm saying here? The way Apple is so obsessed with her destiny, she's so obsessed with getting it no matter what, because at the end of Way to Wonderland, she does accept that people don't have to follow their destinies. But then in Dragon Games later on, Applewhite is still trying to follow her destiny, even when she's accepted that she's not going to go poof if she doesn't follow it. Like, basically, at the end of Way to Wonderland, they basically destroyed the Storybook of Legends. So if Apple truly thought she was going to go poof for not following her destiny, she didn't think that anymore at the end of Way to Wonderland, because she was fine with getting rid of the book. But then in Dragon Games, she is so obsessed with still following her destiny. Why? Because she was never really that worried about people going poof. She was always worried about being the fairest of them all. She doesn't know what her life would be like if she couldn't be the next Snow White. She is literally obsessed with the idea of becoming Snow White, which is exactly what a typical evil queen would want. The evil queen wants to be Snow White. She is so jealous of Snow White. And I think it's crazy. And basically, it's like Applewhite is checking every single box for, like, evil queen, like, for the traits of the evil queen. Applewhite is selfish. She is vain. She's obsessed with being the fairest of them all, and she wants to be powerful. She wants to be queen. She's like there's so many times throughout the series where she's like, I'm the next queen. I'm supposed to be popular. Like, this is supposed to be me. I'm supposed to get my happily ever after. Like, girl, do you hear you? Whereas Raven is just like, whatever. Just like Snow White was. Snow White was like, whatever, it's fine, I'll go live with the dwarves. Raven's like, you know, whatever, I just want to help others. Raven just does whatever is needed to help people. Raven doesn't try too much. Like, when Raven finally got her full powers at the end of Way to Wonderland, we literally see in the next movie, Dragon Games, she was just helping people. Like, people would just come to Raven, they'd be like, Raven, can you do this with your powers? And Raven would be like, sure. Raven was like, sure, I'll try to undo the Wonderland curse. Like, Raven was just doing whatever she wanted, or sorry, whatever other people wanted from her. That's literally what Snow White should do. And actually, I think it's funny because a lot of these foreshadowings, which now I think are foreshadowings for the evil apple arc, originally I thought they were evidence for the swapped at birth theory, but I do agree with you guys. I think, like, people don't necessarily have to act exactly like their parents, which is why I don't really as strongly believe in the swapped at birth theory anymore. But the reason I used to so strongly believe in the swapped at birth theory is because I was like, oh my gosh, this is so obvious. Like, Apple is so similar to the evil queen. I'm like, why are they putting all these clues throughout the books and the show if, like, Apple's not the evil queen's daughter? And then I said, you know what, maybe Apple's not the evil queen's daughter, but that doesn't mean the evil apple arc isn't real. And I think a lot of these things were not necessarily foreshadowing Apple literally being the evil queen's daughter, but I think they were foreshadowing her going through an evil apple arc. So now we are sort of done with this section of the video with talking about the foreshadowing and why I think, you know, there was foreshadowing put into the plot by the writers, but now we are actually going to cover Apple's character development thus far throughout the series. So let's start off with where Apple is at the beginning of the series. So I kind of already said how she acts at the beginning of the series. Like I said, she's selfish, she's vain, she's kind of obsessed with her appearance. Now, what I want to clarify is Apple is not evil. The thing is that Apple seems to lack empathy. Now, hold on, don't get mad at me. Let me just explain it. Apple is only 15. She is not 18 yet. She still has a developing brain. She is very naive, and she has been sheltered all her life. Now, what exactly is empathy? Empathy is basically the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, understand how they feel bad for them, and help them. Now, the thing is, Apple does help people. She does try to do good, but the reason I don't think Apple has empathy is because all her life she's always taught, you're a good princess, you help people, that's what you do. So whenever someone falls down, she helps pick them up. Not because she's thinking empathetically, because like I said, I don't think at the beginning of the series she really has learned empathy yet. I think she's just doing it because she has duty. So I think that, like, from the beginning of the series, Apple actually has a lot of potential for character development, and I actually think that's a good thing. Now, Applewhite is not inherently evil. Now, we know this because basically, before the series even started, the royals and the commoners used to be segregated, and as student body president, it was actually Apple's idea, actually, I don't know if it was her idea, but it was her action to desegregate the royals and the commoners, so she already did something good. Additionally, towards the beginning of the series, and we actually see this in Thronecoming, Apple actually does have pretty good morals. For example, there is a segment in Thronecoming where Headmaster Grimm basically tries to trick Raven Queen into signing the Storybook of Legends by giving, like, Raven this false vision from the wishing well, and when Apple finds out that Headmaster Grimm was trying to trick Raven by giving her this false vision, even though Apple wants Raven to sign the Storybook of Legends, Apple doesn't side with Milton Grimm. Apple sides with Raven because she's like, hey, Milton Grimm, how dare you try to, like, trick my friend? That's wrong. So Apple is a good person. She's trying to be a good person. In her head, at the beginning of the series, I want to make this very clear, Apple always thought she was a good person. Like, as the audience, we can see that she's selfish. We can see that she's thinking a lot more about herself, but she doesn't know this. And let's talk a little bit more about her selfishness and why I think she's selfish, because the reason I think Apple is selfish is because truly the reason that she really just wants Raven to sign the Storybook of Legends is so she can get her destiny. Like I already said, she's very obsessed with getting the Snow White destiny. Now, what Apple tells Raven, and everyone else is like, oh no, Raven, you're being selfish. Like, I just don't want everyone to go poof. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, Apple. Apple, you don't necessarily know if everyone was going to go poof. Like I said, I don't really think Apple White had empathy, and I think Apple White was just kind of using everyone going as poof as an excuse for why Raven should sign the Storybook of Legends, because I don't know if Apple truly believed that. Now, the reason I don't know if Apple truly believed that is because in the books, there's this whole subplot with Bella's sister. Now, Bella's sister is this previous character who didn't sign the Storybook of Legends, and Apple White and Raven Queen basically go on this quest to try to figure out if Bella's sister lived or if she died, and I'll say what happened here. This is a mini spoiler for the book, but basically they end up finding Bella's sister's skeleton in a cave, and then Apple's like, see, Raven, like, she died, like, and Raven's like, this is a little sus. And then at the end of the book, we actually find out that Headmaster Grimm had Helga and Gus put this fake dead body of Bella's sister in a cave to trick Raven and Apple into thinking Bella's sister had actually died when she actually lived. But again, Raven was immediately thinking this is kind of sus, because Raven was like, I thought Headmaster Grimm just said, like, Bella's sister would go poof. But Apple's like, no, Raven, see, she went poof, and then she poofed into a skeleton. And then it's, like, even weirder, because in this cave where they find this skeleton, there's, like, writing in blood. They say it's in red paint, but in blood on the wall that says, I should have signed the book. And Raven's like, this is a little sus, this looks a little fresh, because Bella's sister was supposed to, like, have died a long time ago. Like, why is there a dead bug stuck in this paint blood? And Apple's like, I don't know, Raven, stop questioning it, she obviously died. But here's the thing, just from that arc in the book, we know that Apple knew that not everyone was gonna go poof, because even if Bella's sister didn't sign, and even if Bella's sister did go poof into a skeleton like Apple is saying, which, by the way, I want to point out, Apple was not in on this with Milton Grimm. Like I said, Apple was very against Milton Grimm using trickery to fool Raven, so Apple was not, like, in on this, but Apple was just trying to say, like, Apple was just kind of ignoring that it was kind of weird that there was just a skeleton and paint on the wall in the cave, and, like, it just kind of seemed like a setup. Like, Raven was kind of catching on that it seemed like a conspiracy, whereas Apple was just trying to say, like, oh no, she went poof, she poofed into a skeleton. But it's like, even that, Apple, you know that not everyone is gonna go poof, and Apple's trying to, like throughout the very early beginning of the series, basically from, like, Legacy Day to Throne Coming, Apple's basically trying to tell Raven, like, oh no, you're being selfish because you don't know, there could be unintended consequences of what happened. And it's like, but again, like, Apple, you already saw Bella's sister's, you know, skeleton, and that was kind of sus, and again, that didn't necessarily affect anyone else but Bella's sister, who didn't sign. Like, nobody else really died besides Bella's sister, even if you're going with the setup. So, like I said, I think Apple's being kind of selfish and just using the poof thing as an excuse because she just wants Raven to help her follow her destiny. I also just want to point out that I think Apple is completely wrong about Raven being selfish for Raven not wanting to sign the Storybook of Legends and follow her destiny, and I actually more so think Apple thinking Raven is selfish actually just reflects on Apple's lack of empathy and Apple not being able to understand where Raven is coming from, because the thing is, the way Apple acts, everything comes from her core desire of wanting to follow her destiny and wanting to be the next Snow White. Everything that Apple does, it all leads back to that. Like, yes, like I said, Apple does sort of use people going poof as a scapegoat for why Raven and herself and everyone else needs to follow their destinies, but that's just a scapegoat, because after Apple accepts, oh yeah, people aren't going to go poof, after she accepts that at the end of Way to Wonderland, that layer is peeled away, and we just see Apple's true desire, which is her and Raven following their destinies, because then in Dragon Games, Apple can no longer use people going poof as an excuse, so Apple just tries to do anything in her power to get Raven to turn evil so that she can, like, have her Snow White destiny. So the thing is, because, like I said, Apple acts from her core desire of wanting to be the next Snow White, Apple just, I think, assumes that Raven's core desire is to not be the next evil queen, to not be evil, but the thing is, Apple is completely wrong about Raven's core desire, and Apple can't understand Raven's core desire because, again, her lack of empathy. She can't put herself in Raven's shoes. But Raven's actual core desire is to do the right thing, to help others, to be a good person. That is what Raven actually wants, because, yes, Raven's decision to not sign the Storybook of Legends does start off with Raven, you know, not wanting to follow her destiny and questioning whether or not she should follow her destiny. But the thing is, especially throughout the first Ever After High Shannon Hale book, Raven sort of goes on this quest to kind of try to figure out whether or not she'd go poof if she didn't sign sign the Storybook of Legends. And this sort of culminates with like Raven talking to other people and Raven sort of finding out like, hey, other people aren't really happy with the Destiny system. And then that eventually leads to, you know, Raven and Apple going on that quest where they find Bella's sister's body in the cave. And that sort of also sets off alarm bells. And Raven's like, hey, yeah, that's a little suspicious. That kind of looks like a conspiracy. But Raven's like, maybe it's real. But then, Maddie takes Raven to talk to Giles Grimm in the basement. And that is what truly motivated Raven to not sign the Storybook of Legends. Because she saw Giles Grimm. He was cursed to speak only Riddlish. And he was locked in the basement. And sure, he did tell Raven that she wouldn't go poof and that she shouldn't sign the Storybook of Legends, but even that was hard for Raven to understand because like that was translated from Riddlish, and Maddie says that Riddlish is not an exact language. So I think Raven like was kind of distrustful of what Giles Grimm was saying since she couldn't actually understand him, and like I don't know, Maddie's a little crazy, right? So I think Raven was kind of unsure of what Giles Grimm said, but like at the very least, even if Raven couldn't like take Giles Grimm's word for it that she wouldn't go poof, Raven saw that there was something sus going on. She saw that Giles Grimm was locked down there, and I think Raven knew that it was probably Milton Grimm who did it, even though she didn't know for sure at that point. And I think Raven started to realize like, hey, there is a larger conspiracy afoot. Milton Grimm is probably controlling all of us. He's manipulating all of us, and like, why are we even doing this? This is so dumb. And I think Raven on Legacy Day didn't just take a stand for herself because she didn't want to follow her destiny. I think Raven took a stand for all the rebels, all the people who didn't want to follow their destinies, or all the people who sort of, you know, didn't support the system, because there are rebels like Maddie who do want to follow their destinies, but I think in general the rebels more just like support the idea of like you don't have to follow your destiny, you don't have to follow like this corrupt system that Milton Grimm set up. And I think that is why Raven took a stand. If it was truly just about herself, because before Raven had seen Giles Grimm, Raven had said, you know what, I like maybe Bella's sister's body is real, like I will sign the book, I don't want anybody to get hurt. Like Raven was gonna sign it. It was only after Raven saw Giles that like alarm bells were going off, that Raven knew there is something more here, there's a greater conspiracy afoot. That is what motivated Raven to sort of be the hero. Like Raven was the hero on Legacy. She, like I said, she didn't just do that for herself, she did that for everyone who felt forced into following their destiny. And fun fact, I also feel like Raven actually did that for a lot of other royals as well, because there are royals who we found out later, like Ryer, like Ashlyn, who didn't want to follow their destinies either. Also Darling as well, because on Legacy Day, everybody did also just think Darling was a royal too. So the thing is, Apple can't understand that. Apple can't understand that the reason Raven took a stand on Legacy Day, the reason Raven took a risk and didn't sign the book, wasn't just because Raven was being selfish, because Raven didn't want to be the next evil queen. It was literally because Raven was trying to take a stand to the system. She was trying to take a stand to Milton Grimm. She was trying to show that, hey, there is something corrupt going on here. We have all been lied to Milton Grimm. And that is also why as soon as Raven didn't sign and didn't go poof, Raven sort of whips around and turns to Milton Grimm and says, hey, you were lying. Because Raven knew that Milton Grimm was lying. Anyway, the thing is, Apple is too selfish, and Apple can't understand that, and Apple just goes to thinking that Raven is selfish, but Raven was not selfish. Raven did that not just for herself, but for everyone else. So yeah. Now, let me give you a little bit more insight into Apple's psyche, though, because while on the surface we can say Apple is selfish, like I said, Apple always thought she was a good person. She thought she was coming from a good place. So I want you guys to understand a little bit where Apple is coming from, because actually the reason Apple acts selfishly and acts this way and acts kind of bossy towards all the other characters actually comes from a place of trauma, which you may not know, again, if you haven't read the books, but let's talk about it. So in the first Ever After High book, this is the same book as the whole Bella sister thing. This is the Storybook of Legends by Shannon Hale. We basically find out that when Apple was a very young girl, she fell down a well. Now, what does this have to do with anything else? Let me explain to you. So Apple falls down this well. She has a near-death experience. She thinks she's gonna die. She eventually, after treading water for a while, she gets rescued by the servants, but like, she didn't know if she was ever gonna get out of that well, you know? And after that, she just thinks to herself, you know what? Because every night, like, her parents would like give her a bedtime story about her destiny, you know? And she thinks to herself, you know what? If I can just grow up, if I can eat that apple, get poisoned, get kissed by the prince, wake up, I will have my happily ever after, and nothing bad will ever happen again. And Apple, and I think the books are helpful because we actually get to see the world through Apple's eyes in the books. And I think it's really funny because when I first got into Ever After High, I read the books, I really liked Apple's character, then I watched the show and I was like, oh my gosh, she's so annoying. But I realized Applewhite is the same character. Her character is consistent throughout the books and the show. The reason I like Apple so much more in the book is because I was seeing how she was thinking, whereas in the show, it just seems like she's acting like, you know, a stuck-up brat. But the thing with Apple's psyche and the way she thinks about the world is that basically she thinks that the destinies are necessary so that there can be controlled evil. Now, this is kind of my words explaining how Apple's thinking for you guys, but she basically thinks if there's an evil queen who's allowed to do one evil thing, which is to poison Snow White, then that prevents unintended evil. Apple basically thinks that if there wasn't a destiny system, anybody could just do anything they wanted. People could just have, do any evil act and there could be no controlling. In Apple's mind, the destiny system keeps it so that most of the fairy tales have a happily ever after, the villain gets defeated, and that's a good system. So that's part of the reason why Apple is so obsessed with, like, Raven poisoning her and Raven following the evil queen destiny. It's not because Apple wants to get poisoned. Like, you do actually see in Dragon games when Apple does get poisoned, she's very scared. It's not that Apple wants to get poisoned. It's like Apple, it's like when you go to the doctor to get a shot and you're like, do the shot, get it over with. It's like that. Apple's like, do the shot, poison me, get it over with, then we'll be done with this and I'll never have to face evil for anything. What the thing about this is, though, and even though I think Apple is, like, not, like I said, I don't think she's an inherently bad person. I think she's coming at this from a place of, like, naivete, because again, she was very sheltered. She grew up as a princess. She hasn't really seen a lot of things, and this is just how Apple thinks about the world. But the thing is, this thinking is actually incorrect. It's incorrect to the Ever After High universe. It's incorrect to think that, oh, just because some evil actions are allowed and just because Milton Grimm tries to get everyone to follow the destinies, it doesn't necessarily mean people will listen to that, because we literally have a case example with Raven's mom, the evil queen, because basically Raven's mom, the evil queen, her destiny was literally to poison Snow White, and then that's it. That was the only evil action her, like, Raven's mom, the evil queen, was really supposed to do. Guess what? Raven's mom, the evil queen, did not do that. Basically, she poisoned Snow White. She poisoned Apple's mom, but then she went on to curse Sleeping Beauty. She was not supposed to do that. That was the Dark Fairy's job. And then she went on to curse all of Wonderland, which she definitely wasn't supposed to do, and that's basically what got Raven's mom, the evil queen, locked in mirror prison, right? So if you just look at the setting of Ever After High, you can already see that there is some hypocrisy in Apple's line of thinking that, oh, you need to have the destiny so there can be controlled evil. Because there could be uncontrolled evil anyway. Like, even with the destiny system, even when Raven's mom signed the book, even when Raven's mom followed her destiny, she still did other evil things that she wasn't supposed to do. So Apple's line of thinking is actually flawed, but Apple just can't see that yet. But that's basically where Apple's character development is at the beginning of the series. She's kind of acting from this place of trauma, but also this place of privilege where she doesn't realize how bad other people have it. Hey guys, just a brief interruption because I want to remind you all to comment, like, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, but also check out my business, the Doll Crafter Marketplace. It is the one and only online marketplace made by doll collectors for doll collectors, so anyone can sell anything doll related on there. And actually, I'm currently selling this Maddie Hatter doll as well as some other used dolls on there, so go check it out. We also have reroute kits for customizations. We also have people selling custom dolls on there. It's all really fun. It'll be linked up here. It'll also be linked below, but yeah, go check out the Doll Crafter Marketplace. You can sign up as a seller or as a customer, or just check it out with no commitment. You don't have to sign up. Also, it is free to sign up. But let's continue with Apple's character development. So we'll talk a little bit more about Throne Coming. There's also that scene where sort of Apple and Briar fight during Throne Coming, and basically Briar is like, Apple, like, you sleep for what, like a week, like, you have it easy. And that is what I want. I just want to point that scene out because I think that scene is very important, the fight between Apple and Briar, where Briar basically calls out how privileged Apple is, because I don't think Apple really thought about that. And then also the way that Apple goes to Briar and she's like, we all have our part to play. But I think the line that Apple says where she's like, Briar, we all have our part to play, I think, again, that says a lot to Apple's inner psyche of thinking, okay, we all have to play our part in this storybook world, or like everything kind of combust on itself. Because I think when, ever Milton Grimm was telling Apple, like, oh, if we don't follow our destinies, we'll go poof, Apple's probably just thinking not just about going poof, but the idea that just, like, everything could collapse. Because, like I said, in Apple's mind, it was safer to follow the destinies because then you could have controlled evil instead of, like, uncontrolled evil. So I think the reason Apple is, like, telling Briar she has to play her part is because, like, Apple knows that their characters, they all sort of know that they're characters in the fairy tale world, but in Apple's mind, like, you sort of have to keep balance. It's kind of like Star Wars. You have to keep balance in the Force. Like, you have to keep balance in the fairy tale world, and I think that's why Apple said that to Briar. But again, I think Briar's correct as well, that Apple just doesn't think about how hard other people have it. And I think this is why so many other royals, like Ashlyn, Briar, even Darling, because Darling was originally a royal, like, they all kind of throughout the series just became rebels because they had worse destinies than Apple did, or like they just disagreed with their destinies more than Apple did, because Apple, like I said, Apple only had to be poisoned, like, for what, a week. But let's kind of get on to Apple's character development in Way to Wonderland. Well, Spring Unsprung, not that much happens to Apple in Spring Unsprung, mainly because she's, like, possessed, or like she's under that topsy-turvy curse for like most of the movie or special or whatever. But again, I don't really know that much about the topsy-turvy curse. I have thought that maybe it is foreshadowing for how she may act when she's evil, but yeah, let's just get on to Way to Wonderland because I think that's more interesting for Apple's character. So basically what happens in Way to Wonderland is throughout Way to Wonderland, they're all working together, and then they're trying to, you know, kind of like save Lizzie's mom, save the Queen of Hearts from Courtly Jester, but then they're also trying to sort of, you know, reverse the curse on Wonderland. That's what first got them to go to Wonderland and have Raven accidentally transport them to Wonderland. But throughout the movie, Raven's magic is kind of out of control, because since Raven never signed the book, she doesn't really have full control over her powers, right? And this basically culminates in the scene where they're trying to fight Courtly Jester, and basically Raven is giving the choice to whether or not to sign the Storybook of Legends, because if Raven signs the Storybook of Legends, then she'd get her full power and they could use it to defeat Courtly. But Raven's kind of hesitant to do this because she's like, oh my gosh, this is the one thing I didn't want to do, but it could save everyone. And Raven's kind of concerned that when she signs it, she'll lose control and just become so evil. But Apple basically has this moment where she's like, where Apple's like, Raven, I actually don't think you have it in you. I don't think you can be evil. And I think this is an important moment for like Raven's character, but I think that's also kind of an important moment for Apple's character, because it's like Apple's finally accepting that Raven just doesn't have it in her to be evil, and that even if Raven signed the Storybook of Legends, Apple still doesn't really think Raven's just gonna magically turn evil. So yeah, sure enough, Raven signs it, Raven defeats Courtly, and like Raven's kind of going crazy, but Apple's able to like calm Raven down, and then Raven never really tries to turn evil again or anything. And I think that just goes to show that Apple, first of all, it shows like character development between Apple and Raven, that Apple finally is kind of accepting that Raven's not going to be evil. But I think that also shows, again, like I said, how selfless Raven is in opposition to Apple, which this will be important later. But I think that shows that Raven is willing to, you know, sacrifice the future she wanted, if it meant, you know, saving everyone in Wonderland from Courtly. So I think that was actually quite a noble action on Raven's part, but also it was very nice on Apple's part as well to try to, like, you know, console Raven and try and believe that Raven was going to turn evil. And then what actually happens at the end of Way to Wonderland is they finally have the Storybook of Legends back, and Apple, Briar, and Raven are sort of having this discussion on this balcony in Wonderland, and they're like, you know what, I don't think we need this. And basically in that moment, Apple does agree with Briar and Raven, and she's like, you know what, I think it should really be up to everyone to choose whether or not they're going to follow their destiny, which I just want to point out how crazy that is, because that's literally the rebel stance. The rebel stance from the beginning of Ever After High is like, it should be your choice whether or not you want to follow your destiny. And literally, Apple agreed with that. Apple agreed with that at the end of Way to Wonderland. That's crazy, because obviously Apple for herself still wants to be Snow White. But she agreed with, you know, Raven, it's fine, we should allow people to have the choice. Okay, so I just rewatched this scene from the end of Way to Wonderland, and I have something to add, because I never noticed before, but Apple was actually still being very selfish in this moment, because yes, she does agree with Raven and Briar that it should be up to each person's choosing whether or not they follow their destiny, but the thing she says right before that is, hey, maybe this book is more trouble than it's worth if it can allow people to steal other people's destinies. Guys, Apple was still being selfish in this moment. The only reason she fully agreed to let Raven destroy the Storybook of Legends is because Apple had just seen Courtly try to steal Lizzie's destiny. And remember how obsessed Apple is with the Snow White destiny. She wants to do anything to get it, and that, I think, is a part of the reason why Apple was originally so obsessed with everyone following the Storybook of Legends is because she wanted to keep order. She wanted to secure, you know, her kingdom, her future. And when she saw Courtly try to steal Lizzie's kingdom, Lizzie's future, Apple was like, oh shoot, that could happen to me too. Maybe we should just get rid of this book, then nobody can steal it, then I can still get my happily ever after. And that is why it makes sense that in Dragon Games, Apple is still so incessant on her happily ever after. Apple never gave up the idea of, you know, trying to force Raven down this evil path. At the end of Way to Wonderland, she simply just said, yeah, let's get rid of the book. We don't need the book, because I think Apple did realize they don't need the book. They're not going to go poof without the book. She did accept that, but she was still being selfish. Like I said, I don't think if she hadn't seen Courtly try to steal Lizzie's destiny by signing Lizzie's page in the book, I think if Apple hadn't seen that, Apple wouldn't have agreed to let Raven destroy or dissolve the book, which I'm going to explain that in the next clip. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what actually happens at the end of Way to Wonderland, because it's a little unclear, but basically Raven holds the book and she sort of goes like this and she goes like that, and all the pages fly out, and then the pages from the Storybook of Legends kind of fly back into each like person's heart. So I basically think that was giving everyone their page in Storybook of Legends back, because I've made other theories about this, but I think how the Storybook of Legends works is it's kind of like a soul contract, and it holds a piece of each person's soul, which is like why Raven had to sign it to unlock her full soul to get her full powers. So I think it holds a piece of each person in the book, and that's how they're bound to the book. So when Raven sort of destroyed or dissolved the book at the end of Way to Wonderland, it sent all the pages back into each character to allow them to sort of, create their own destiny, rewrite, ignite, restart, write their own future. And like I said, Apple agreed to this. So then what the heck happened in Dragon Games? Because I've seen so many people be like, oh my gosh, they ruined Apple's character development in Dragon Games. And I don't think they did. Because I actually think, dare I say, Ever After High, the way Apple's written is like a very realistic depiction of a teenager. Because you have to keep in mind, in Way to Wonderland, who was in Wonderland? Guess what? Headmaster Grimm was not in Wonderland. Snow White was not in Wonderland. Guess who tries to control Apple? Headmaster Grimm, Snow White. They were not in Wonderland. So nobody was trying to control Apple in Wonderland, which I think is why she felt so free to admit that she agreed with Raven. But by the time we get back to Ever After High, first of all, Raven's already so popular. So when they get back to Ever After High, Apple is kind of freaking out because Raven is getting more popular than her. That's already kind of, a hit to Apple's ego, because like we said, Apple is kind of vain. Additionally, Apple is getting pressure from her mom. Snow White is like, Apple, why aren't you as popular? Why is Raven more popular than you? And Apple's mom is once again trying to pressure her to follow her destiny. Which Apple didn't have a problem with that. But the problem is that Snow White's trying to get Apple to pressure Raven to follow her destiny. Now, like I said, Apple never really wanted to trick Raven, but Apple isn't above coercing Raven, and Apple's getting pretty desperate in Dragon Games, and honestly it's mainly because of the pressure of her mom. I would also say Milton Grimm, but Milton Grimm doesn't really talk to Apple that much in Dragon Games. It's mainly Snow White who's pressuring Apple. And so I think the reason Apple is fine with, lying about the evil queen, lying about freeing the evil queen, helping the evil queen try to get Raven to turn evil at the beginning of Dragon Games, the reason Apple's fine with that when Apple was not okay with Milton Grimm, tricking Raven before, is because Apple is basically under so much stress she doesn't know what to do, because Apple has basically lost her excuse of, oh no, everyone's gonna go poof if you don't sign Raven, because literally the book's gone, you agreed, and you also admitted that even though Raven signed the book, Raven's probably still not gonna follow her destiny anyway. So basically Apple can't use the book as an excuse anymore. In Dragon Games, we're kind of finally seeing Apple's true colors without the excuse of, oh no, everyone's gonna go poof. And again, like I said, I think it's very interesting, and I think Apple doesn't really care. Like I said, she doesn't really care about the book anymore. She's not using the excuse of, oh, everyone's gonna go poof, because like I said, Apple never really cared about anybody else's destiny. She mainly just cared about her destiny. The reason she's only caring about Raven, she never asked the evil queen, like, oh, evil queen, could you make a new Storybook of Legends? Could you make everyone follow their destiny? No, because Apple didn't care about that. Apple only cared about her destiny. She only cared about Raven poisoning her. In fact, she didn't even care about Raven that much poisoning her, because she even made a deal with the evil queen during Dragon Games where the evil queen basically promises, oh, Apple, if you help me get Raven on my side, I'll make sure you get your happily ever after. And the evil queen did do that, but by the way, it wasn't even Raven who had to poison Apple. It was like the evil queen and Fabel who poisoned her. So that's a whole other thing, but basically I think Apple was kind of driven to a breaking point by her mom, and I do think it's realistic that even though she agreed with them, because like I said, I don't think Apple changed her stance on like allowing people to have a choice. I do think she agreed that, nobody's gonna go poof, it's fine, people can have a choice at the end of Way to Wonderland. The reason it seems that she backpedaled so much is because her mom was pressuring so much about her becoming the next Snow White. I also think it may be a thing with like the royals where they feel like to secure their royal title, to secure their kingdom, to secure their destiny, they need to like play out their destiny. So it may also be a thing where like maybe her mom was concerned like Apple wouldn't be like a legitimate queen if she didn't follow the Snow White destiny, that maybe like the public would start questioning whether or not they should like overthrow their rulers. And I think there's a lot more politics that could go into that maybe, just like Snow White was concerned about them like losing their power and influence, because the reason that they were allowed to keep their power and influence was because of their titles, which they got their titles from the fairy tale, right? So I can see that. So basically Apple's just under a lot of pressure, and I think that's why she caved to work with the evil queen. But obviously by the end of Dragon Games, Apple does sort of learn something, because then sort of after the evil queen has overtaken Ever After High, Apple and Raven do have that discussion in Dragon Games. It's the discussion where Raven finds out that Apple freed her mother, but Apple like kind of goes to Raven and she's like, Raven, don't you want to hang out with your mom? Don't you want to be happy? This is so great. And then Raven's like, how could you think this is great? And then basically Raven finds out, like I said, that Apple freed her mom, and she's like, Apple, how could you do this? And then Apple's like getting upset and she's like, Raven, but we were supposed to be friends. And then Raven goes, Apple, that's not how the story ends. And I love that line because it just, once again shows Apple's hypocrisy. Like, Apple wanted to be friends with Raven, but Apple also wanted Raven to poison her. She wanted Raven to be her enemy and her friend. And this is what I'm saying. Like, Apple thinks from this selfish place. Like, Apple's not really fully thinking, because if Apple was fully thinking, she would actually be trying to be enemies with Raven. Like, she wouldn't be trying to be friends. But like, from the beginning of every time, Apple kept like trying to be friendly with Raven. And I think that also just shows how naive Apple is, because she's like, yeah, if I'm nice to Raven, she'll want to poison me. I'm like, girl, that's not how it works. And I think like Apple was really humbled by Raven in Dragon Games, because like Apple just had this unrealistic expectation of the world that like Raven would someday just like agree to be evil. And it's like, Apple, that's not how it works. Like, I thought you like, it's like, and it's like Apple's being friends with Raven while she wants Raven to like dislike her. It's so weird. And I love that Raven pointed that out, but I think that also kind of shattered Apple's whole world, because basically when Raven said that, Apple realized, wait, like, I'm finally getting what I wanted. Like, I wanted Raven to be mad at me, but I don't want that because now I don't have any friends. Because basically, I think it's also so crazy that by the time we get to Dragon Games, Apple has kind of pushed all of her friends away. Like, I didn't mention this earlier, but earlier in Apple's character development, like, she had kind of pushed Ashlyn away when she got very judgmental about Ashlyn and Hunter's relationship. And sure, she said that she finally accepted Ashlyn and Hunter's relationship, but I think that all felt a little sus to Ashlyn. Then again, in Throne Coming, she kind of insulted Briar, said that, oh, Briar, it doesn't matter, like, we all have our part to play. I think that really hurt Briar, and she was basically never as close with Briar and Ashlyn after those two things. And the main person that she's close with by the time we get to Dragon Games is Raven, because she kind of pushed all her friends away because she was being so controlling. And I think, again, that also goes to show Raven's selflessness, because I think Raven does understand that Apple does not really sort of like, that Apple doesn't really have the best mom, and that Apple, you know, kind of is coming from this naive place. And I think like Raven does have a lot of compassion for Apple for putting up with Apple, because I think a lot of other people would not have put up with Apple. And again, I think that just goes to show that Raven's a good person, because Raven was still very kind to Apple, even like when Apple didn't agree with her. But I think when Raven sort of walked away from Apple and's like, Apple, that's not how the story ends, I think Apple sort of had an earth-shattering moment where she realized, oh no, I ruined everything. Like, I pushed all my friends away because I was so obsessed with getting my destiny. And then the one person who I was like low-key still friends with, I pushed her away and I wanted her to be evil. And then I think Apple just has like this earth-shattering moment. And then, you know, a little bit later in Dragon Games, she eventually escapes. She goes to the Enchanted Forest to meet up with her other friends and Raven. And I think at that point, Apple's kind of like, you know what? I feel bad. Like, Apple feels bad about, you know, freeing the evil queen at that point. But then Apple gets poisoned. And then that puts, you know, that's just crazy. And we'll address the kiss in a little bit. But basically, after Apple gets waked up, they go and fight the evil queen. And basically, the declaration that Apple has at the end of this movie when they're fighting the evil queen is like, the evil queen's like, don't destroy me, you'll never get, like you're happily ever after, like, yada, yada, yada. And Apple's like, well, then I'll just have to find my happily ever after another way. Like, maybe it won't happen exactly how I thought, but it'll still happen. And I think that's very interesting, because it basically shows that at the end of Dragon Games, Apple had basically had faith, you know what, maybe Raven's not gonna be evil, and that's fine. And, I'll just find my happily ever after the other way. And I think it's very interesting, because at the end of Throne Coming, it's like she kind of accepts, okay, we don't need the Storybook of Legends, people can choose. But then in Dragon Games, she gets pressured back into sort of, you know, trying to get her destiny. Not get everyone's destiny, but just get her destiny so she can be the next Snow White, by sort of, you know, trying to get the evil queen to help Raven be evil. But then by the end of Dragon Games, she sort of learns, you know what, maybe I don't need the evil queen, I don't need these other people, I can just have my happily ever after and have it myself. Because again, I think at the end of Way to Wonderland, Apple was still thinking, like, I'm going to try to get the Snow White destiny, and throughout Dragon Games, she's still trying to get the Snow White destiny. But I think basically Apple's declaration at the end of Dragon Games was like, you know what, maybe I'm not going to get the Snow White destiny, maybe it's not going to look exactly like that, I don't know. But here's the thing, that's kind of confusing, because Apple, by the time she says that to the evil queen at the end of Dragon Games, she's kind of already had her destiny, because she already got poisoned, she already got woken. And I think Apple just hadn't exactly processed what happened, because also when she was fighting the evil queen, I don't even think she knew that it was actually Darling who woke her. Because now we can actually talk about this, because I don't think Apple actually discovered till later who actually woke her, till like after Dragon Games, so we don't ever see Apple's reaction to that in Dragon Games, because when she wakes up in Dragon Games, she's like, oh, Daring woke me? No, his sister did. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about how Apple appears in Epic Winter, because we get to Epic Winter, which takes place right after Dragon Games, and Apple and Daring are both very depressed because they thought they were destined true loves, and Daring couldn't wake Apple, but Darling did. And they're both very sad, and Daring does get a happily ever after, you know, with Rosabella in Epic Winter, but the thing is, and I think they, like, couldn't cover this for censorship reasons, it's a whole thing with Mattel. Also, just, like, Epic Winter's, like, a bad movie. The only good part of Epic Winter is Daring and Rosabelle. Like, everything else is bad. But, like, they never covered what happened with Apple and Darling in Epic Winter, which, like I said, is a whole other thing. But basically, what I want to say is what I think happened that we don't see on screen, what I think happened off screen, is somewhere after Dragon Games, Apple found out that Darling woke her, and Apple had, like, a crisis. Like, I was gonna say a midlife crisis. She's like a teenager. But I think Apple had a crisis because she was, like, her whole life, she was building up that this Prince Daring was gonna wake her. Now, first of all, I want to address this. I don't think Apple was, like, ever in love with Daring. And I don't think she was, like, jealous of Rosabella for getting with Daring or anything. I think it was just that, like, she liked the idea of being with Daring. She never really loved Daring. I think if she loved Daring, she would have been way more mad about him, like, dating every girl in the school, you know? Or dating every single girl who has red in her color palette. Because, like, tell me why, like, every single ship with Daring, it's, like, Apple, who's red? Cerise, who's red? Lizzie, who's red? Rosabelle, who's red? Even with Darling, too. Because, like, the two main ships for Darling are either, like, Chase Redford, the son of the, like, the Red Queen, the Red Knight, or Apple, who's also red. Like, what is this? What is this with Daring and Darling? I don't know. They're both obsessed with red. It's a little weird. But anyway, I think Apple found this out and was like, okay, what is my life? Is Darling my destined true love? Like, what does this mean? And I think basically Apple was just very, very confused after Dragon Games and wasn't sure if she had completed her destiny or if she still needed to, and was just like I said, she had been told her destiny as a bedtime story every night. She'd been told, like, this handsome prince is gonna wake you. And even though I don't really think she's truly in love with Daring, she's in love with the idea of being with Daring. It's now, like, Apple's whole life, everything she thought is uncertain because she doesn't know what she is supposed to do next. So I think that's why she is so depressed in Epic Winter and doesn't really know what's going to happen. And that's basically the last time we see Apple. So now we are going to get into the third part of this video, which is the evil Apple arc, what I think would basically happen after Epic Winter and Dragon Games. So basically, like I said, where we left off, Apple's kind of in a crisis. She doesn't really know if she completed her destiny or not. She's kind of just really confused about what to do next with her life. And her whole life, she's built up to having this Snow White destiny. And then when it actually almost happened, it didn't happen the way she thought it was going to be. And I think this would drive Apple a little crazy. And I also think it's possible that when the Evil Queen was working with Apple, or when the Evil Queen poisoned Apple, I think it's very possible that the Evil Queen somehow planted something in Apple's brain that would make her go a little crazy. And I sort of talked about this in my other videos, but I think the evil Apple arc wouldn't just be Apple turning evil of her own volition. I think there might be some manipulation from, like, the Evil Queen and, like, maybe planting something in Apple's brain, like a little thing that, like, whispers bad ideas to her, like, so then when Apple's in this crisis after Dragon Game, she's sitting there thinking, I didn't follow my destiny, and then this little thing in Apple's head is like, yeah, you're horrible, you're not a Snow White. And basically, I think somewhere after Dragon Game, somewhere after Epic Winter, what basically drives Apple to think she's the next evil queen is she has this little voice in her head telling her, like, you didn't follow your destiny, you are not Snow White, Daring couldn't wake you. And I think Apple will have this crisis, and Apple will think to herself, well, you know what? I'm selfish. Because remember how I said the selfishness was a very important part to Apple's character? I think that's what happened. I think Apple would basically look back at her life while she's having this crisis and trying to understand what happened to her in Dragon Games. And I think Apple would start to realize, wait, I've been vain my whole life. I've been selfish. Nothing I've done is really how Snow White should act. And I think Apple would start to realize, maybe I'm not Snow White. Maybe that's why Daring couldn't wake me. And then I think Apple will start to think to herself, you know what the problem is? There's no evil queen. The evil queen's locked in mirror prison. There's no evil. Because remember how I said Apple thought there had to be, like, some sort of balance in the fairy tale world? Like, there had to be good and evil to balance, and the evil had to be, like, checked by the good, and, like, there had to be a balance. I think Apple's gonna think to herself, oh my gosh, since Raven's not being the evil queen, everything's out of balance, everything's out of whack. Maybe, like, I need to be the next evil queen. So that's how basically it would happen. Like, Apple would basically convince herself that everything's out of balance. She's not the proper Snow White. She's selfish. I think it may also maybe have something to do with Apple's hair. I know I've talked a lot about Apple's hair in the past. I'm not going to get into it in here. But, like, in the early Ever After High books, which is where I think they were first setting up the evil Apple arc idea, media, they talk a lot about how like Apple was seen as a disappointment for having her blonde hair, because part of the Snow White destiny is to have ebony black hair. But I think Apple may start to see maybe like I'm not the proper Snow White. Maybe that's why I have blonde hair. Maybe I was never supposed to be Snow White. And again, even if the swapped at birth theory isn't true, there's also a possibility that like Apple could find out that the evil queen, like the previous evil queen, actually had like platinum blonde hair, and maybe Apple could think, oh, maybe that's because I'm more similar to the evil queen. And I think that could also, you know, feed into Apple's identity crisis. So basically, as Apple's going through this identity crisis, she's thinking, maybe I'm not Snow White. Maybe there's not enough evil. Maybe I need to be the evil queen. So basically, I think throughout this arc, Apple would basically try to learn evil. Maybe she'd try to break the original evil queen out of mirror prison again. She'd basically do a bunch of stuff. But what I want you guys to know about the evil Apple arc is it ends in a good way. Because I'm not going to, like, make up fan fiction here and say, oh, what I think would happen. Like, oh, is Apple going to, like, try to kill Raven or something? Because, like, I don't know exactly what would happen during the evil Apple arc. Maybe somebody can write a fan fiction about that, but like what I'm trying to explain to you, like the narrative purposes and how, like the development the evil Apple arc would give Apple. But basically, like I said, I just mainly think she tried to be evil. Maybe she tries to go take over the evil queen's like previous evil castle and like rule it as the evil queen. But how I think this evil Apple arc has to end, and actually what I think would be a good completion for the series, is Apple actually turning back to good. Because when I say evil Apple arc, I don't mean her staying evil forever. I mean her getting a redemption. A final redemption. Because remember how I said, like, Apple was very selfish. At the beginning of the series, she didn't have empathy. She didn't know how to put herself in other people's shoes. Well, guess what? By trying to be evil and failing, she is finally learning empathy. She's actually finally putting herself in Raven's shoes and is learning what it feels like to be expected to be the next greatest evil ever known. And when she does that, I think she's going to fail. She's going to realize she can't be evil, and she's eventually going to come back to good, and maybe Darling will help her with that somehow. And again, we know Darling is like supposed to be like a hero. Like, that's Darling's archetype. She saved Apple. She was the White Knight. I do think Apple will end up with Darling. And so basically I think like Raven and Darling would help Apple somehow come back to the light side, get redeemed, finally accept that it's okay that Raven didn't follow her destiny, and it's okay that Apple didn't follow her destiny exactly how she thought it would be, and Apple still can have a great life. I think Apple would learn a lot from the evil Apple arc, and I think the evil Apple arc is really actually something that could help with her redemption, help with her finally learning her lesson for good. Because like I said, it kind of seemed like at the end of Way to Wonderland she learned her lesson, but by the time we get to Dragon Games, we know that lesson did not stick, because she has to like learn a similar lesson again in Dragon Games. And like I said, I do think it's realistic for a teenager to go back and forth, especially when they're being manipulated by their parents. And like I said, I do think she actually did learn at the end of Way to Wonderland that not everyone has to follow their destiny. I think in Dragon Games it was no longer about like the book, because the Storybook of Legends was destroyed in Dragon Games, or by the time we get to Dragon Games it was dissolved by Raven. It was just about getting Raven to be evil so she could have her destiny, so she could have her kingdom. And then after Dragon Games, I think needs to happen with the evil Apple arc is Apple to try to be evil, to try to take the place of the evil queen, to try to be the next evil queen, because she thinks she's failed as Snow White, and she starts to finally realize that she's selfish. Like, Apple finally would gain self-awareness from this evil Apple arc. She'd finally realize, I'm being selfish. And like I said, I think there might be some manipulation, like a little voice planted in her head by the evil queen, helping her go that far evil, because I don't think Apple would just like try to be evil on her own. I think there might be something pushing her to being evil. But basically, once that happens, I think she would finally be able to, get redeemed. She would fail at being evil. She'd realize she doesn't like being evil. I also think, like, do you remember that episode earlier on in the series where they swap classes and, like, Apple tries to do, like, is it Home Evilnomics? Apple tries to take Home Evilnomics and she fails. That could have also been foreshadowing for the evil Apple arc, because that's kind of like a smaller version of what happens in the evil Apple arc. Like, she tries to be evil and she fails. And yeah, I do think she would probably end up with Darling, because Darling did wake her. And I think Apple just would need to, accept that that's fine and stuff. But yeah, that's basically the evil Apple arc. I don't know. Let me know if you guys have any questions about it. I think it's a very interesting idea. I think it adds a lot to the story. I also think the idea of like the visual idea of an evil apple is very interesting, which is why I'm wearing this outfit. Also, by the way, I didn't like buy this dress to be apple white or something. I think some people thought that. I actually just got this for my Halloween costume. I was just looking for medieval dress in general, and I was just looking for colors that would look good on me, and this looked good on me. Today I am dressed up as evil apple, but when you saw like the other photos of me in this, I was just like dressed up in general. But like today I am actually trying to be apple. I have like specific apple things on, and I also did, this is not Apple Wright's regular makeup, this is like an evil apple look. Let me know if you like it. And I do actually really want to make like an evil Apple custom doll. I have a very specific vision in my head of what evil Apple White looks like. Like she has like darker makeup, and actually she has like red streaks in her hair. I really like the idea of an evil apple. I also really thought it'd be interesting if for the evil apple arc, like Raven does kind of take the place of Snow White. I didn't mention that, but like what if like Apple like somehow poisoned, you know, Raven, and then Raven has to get woken up by like Dexter or something? That could be interesting. Actually, when I originally thought of the evil apple arc when I was like a kid, I thought Apple actually would poison Raven. The reason I didn't really mention that in this video too much is because that was before Dragon Games came out, and then by the time Dragon Games came out, I was like, oh, I don't know if they're gonna do the poisoned apple thing twice, but I think it would be interesting because I just, like, with everything they were setting up at the very beginning of the series, I always really felt like they were just setting up, like, Apple to somehow accidentally follow the Evil Queen's destiny, somehow get pushed into that by her choices, and Raven to get pushed into the Snow White destiny by her choices. And because I think especially after the Storybook of Legends gets destroyed, a lot of, like, the destinies that end up happening a lot of them happen because of the characters' choices. I've kind of mentioned this in my previous videos, but I actually do not think Darling was originally destined to be the White Knight or to be Apple's Princess Charming. I think she was just originally destined to be a damsel in distress, and I think her original destiny was very likely the Maiden Marian destiny, but we don't know for sure. I made another theory about that. But I think the reason Darling was able to wake Apple and become her Princess Charming is because, like, Darling became a hero. She literally changed her fate. She literally rewrote her destiny. And I think, similarly, actually, I think Apple rewrote her destiny. Like, I think it's very likely that Apple is not swapped at birth and was just the Snow White's daughter. But I think Apple, similar to Darling, but in a worse way, I think Apple kind of rewrote her destiny by being selfish, by being vain throughout the whole series, by checking literally every single Evil Queen box. She accidentally willed herself to become the next Evil Queen. So that's another interesting theory, but I know, let me know what you guys think. Make sure to leave a comment down below. Tell me what you think of this theory. Leave a little apple emoji if you watch this till the end, and like this video. Subscribe to my channel to see more Ever After High content coming your way. Also tell me what other content you'd like to see. And check out my other socials. They're linked down below. Check out my business, the Doll Crafter Marketplace. It's linked down below. Anyway, bye guys. Have a great day.